Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We have a special show today. It's just going to be me. So buckle up. This is a bit of a preview, a summary, I guess, of a series that we're going to be doing on the Constitution and its history. We're going to take apart the machinery of freedom and figure out how it actually works. We're kicking off something big, full throttle, 90-minute crash course through the history, the ideas, and the hard lessons that led to the U.S. Constitution. Maybe it's 90 minutes. Who knows? Math, whatever. But this is the story of the human experiment, the American experiment of liberty, the most audacious act of political engineering in human history. Because when those founders wrote "We the People," when they wrote it down, they weren't just writing a document. They were detonating a bomb under the old order of the world. For thousands of years, humanity lived by the same rule book. Kings rule, priests bless, and everyone else shuts the hell up and pays taxes. And then one scrappy little group of colonists decided maybe, just maybe, people could govern themselves. Not perfectly, certainly not painlessly, but on purpose, with intent. And that idea, once spoken aloud, has refused to die. But here's one thing about freedom. It's not magic. It didn't appear out of thin air in 1776. It was built brick by brick over centuries by philosophers and rebels and preachers and merchants and soldiers and even heretics who refused to keep their heads down. Every generation added a piece, usually after getting burned by the last one. The Constitution is a final draft of a 2,000-year argument about power. Who gets it, what limits it, and what the hell keeps it from destroying everything around it. We'll trace that argument from the marble halls of Athens to the muddy fields of Virginia, through the fall of Rome, the fires of the Reformation, the pens of Enlightenment philosophers, and the blood and smoke of revolution. And by the end of this hour and a half, you'll see the Constitution not as a relic, but as a living blueprint of an idea, one that's being tested to this day and will continue to be tested into perpetuity. So let's start off by admitting a few things that too many people forget. The founders didn't invent freedom. They inherited the scars of people who tried to find it before them. These have been building blocks throughout all of time. And every time those people failed, they left clues behind. Lessons, warnings, blueprints, all scribbled in blood and ink. And that's what this episode is about, connecting the dots across centuries to see how the hell we ended up here with a system that puts ordinary citizens above kings and laws above power for the first time. Because if we don't understand where it came from, we damn sure can't keep it. This is the DNA of a revolution. And before we get into it any further, shameless plug, I have a Substack that's going to break this all down into 30 separate episodes, or entries rather, journal entries. That'll start tonight, actually today, Wednesday, and November 5th. And that'll go on for Monday, Wednesday, Friday, every week until it's completed. So about 10 weeks. So go check that out. That's Dan Holloway on Substack or danholloway.substack.com. Let's be real. The American founders weren't magicians. They were lawyers and farmers, philosophers and war fighters trying to solve one colossal problem. How do you build a government strong enough to hold this nation together, but weak enough that it doesn't crush its own people? We have this saying, when the state is big, people are small. When the state is large, people are small. The individual is small. We have no tolerance for that here. We are all about the individual in America. And that's the paradox baked right into our system. It's why the Constitution is a balancing act between freedom and order, between majority and minority, between state and federal power. Excuse me. And the answers they found obviously didn't come out of nowhere. They were stolen, borrowed, and improved from the entire history of human governance. From Greece, they took the idea of citizenship, that the common man had a role to play in the destiny of his city. From Rome, they took republican virtue, the notion that liberty depends on discipline and duty, and those are the two anchors of citizenship, rights and responsibilities, as we talk about on this show all the time. From England, they stole the very best idea monarchy ever had, that even a king could be bound by the law. And from the Enlightenment, they absorbed the radical belief that reason, not birth or blood, should guide how we rule ourselves. It's all in there, coded in every article, every amendment, and every word. But here's the catch. Every time humanity figured out how to build a decent system, someone got greedy. Republics rotted, monarchs lied, democracies turned into mobs. And the founders studied all of that like forensic scientists at a crime scene. They weren't just writing a constitution. They were writing an antidote to tyranny, one tested formula at a time. They'd seen what happens when people get lazy or let someone else, quote, handle it. As Plato said, if you refuse to take part in your own governance, you're doomed to be ruled by fools. That's why they built a machine that requires constant maintenance by citizens, not experts, not elites, us. And maybe that's the most important part of the American experiment. It's not supposed to run on autopilot. First, let's address the problem of power. There's a line from John Adams, that hits harder the older you get. Because power corrupts, society's demands for moral authority and character increase as importance of the position increases. Translation, the bigger your title, the less you can afford to be an asshole. That idea that virtue is necessary for liberty, it's ancient. It's what Aristotle meant when he said that a republic can only survive if its citizens are educated and morally grounded. And it's what Romans meant by civic virtue, and the founders read that stuff like scripture. But they also knew the dark side, that the human instinct for control never dies. Every tyrant starts as someone who swears they'll fix things just for a while, 2 weeks, to flatten the curve, just for now. Every empire collapses under the weight of its own bullshit. And that's why the Constitution's first words aren't the government of the United States. They're we the people. It starts with the individual and it ends with the individual. Everything in between exists to serve, not to rule. All right? And I'm going to be blunt. The reason this stuff matters isn't nostalgia. It's not just about our history. It's about survival. Because we live in a world where apathy is the new tyranny. People scroll past corruption like it's a weather report. We outsource our outrage, rent our opinions from other people, and mistake attention for truth. Sophistry. And while we do that, the same ancient forces, greed and fear, central control, keep reinventing themselves with shinier branding and better PR. And quite a bit better delivery mechanism now with the internet as well. So yeah, understanding the Constitution isn't just about patriotism points. It's not about showing how clever you are. It's about knowing the rules of the game so you don't get played. Now, over the next 9 segments or so, we'll trace the genealogy of freedom, how each era added a brick or tore one down and then left behind a warning. From the Athenian Agora to the Federal Convention of 1787, you'll see how ideas fought, evolved, and occasionally set the world on fire. And by the end, I hope you see what the founders saw, which is this. Liberty isn't something handed down. It's something fought for, intellectually, spiritually, and sometimes quite literally. And that is because freedom is not a gift. It's a goddamn responsibility. And this is Citizen Podcast. Now, before we get to America, before there's a Constitution, a Bill of Rights, or even the idea of citizen in the way that we think of it now, we have to go all the way back to where people first started asking the most dangerous question in politics, even to this day. Why the hell should one man rule another? That question got its first real test in ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and political headaches. The Greeks invented the idea of the citizen. Think of Athens in the 5th century BC. The Persians are gone. The city's rebuilding. And ordinary men, farmers and merchants and soldiers are walking into the assembly to vote on how the city runs. It's messy and loud and emotional. They argue and they shout. They insult each other's mothers, I'm sure. I don't know to what degree people talk shit about each other's moms back then. I'm guessing a bit of it popped up. But they do something no other civilization had even done before. They decided to decide together. And this is where the concept of citizenship is born. not as subjects or slaves to some monarch, but people who share in both rights and responsibilities of governance, citizens. And now this isn't some utopian paradise. Athenian democracy had some pretty brutal flaws. Women couldn't vote, obviously. Slavery was normal. And mob rule could turn deadly overnight. The direct democracy part of it went away pretty quickly. But the idea that free men could deliberate, decide, and hold each other accountable at the time was revolutionary. Now, Aristotle looked at that experiment and tried to make sense of it. And he said that there are three basic forms of government. The first is monarchy, obviously, a rule by one. And then there's an aristocracy, which is ruled by a few. And then polity, which is ruled by many. Each has a good version and a corrupt version. Obviously, monarchy will become tyranny, aristocracy will become oligarchy, and polity becomes democracy, and if it goes bad, mob rule. Now, Aristotle didn't hate democracy. He just knew that without virtue and reason, it eats itself alive. Does that sound familiar? John Adams has a similar quote. When the founders read Aristotle, they weren't just admiring old wisdom. They were studying a manual for how free societies die, which is not from outside attack, but typically from within. The Greeks taught the founders that freedom without discipline is chaos, that education and debate and civic duty aren't luxuries. They're survival tools. Aristotle even warned that people who stop participating in their government stop deserving freedom. He called them slaves by nature. That's brutal, but that old bastard had a point, didn't he? When you choose to subjugate yourself, you become a slave by nature. And then came Rome, the empire everyone remembers, but very few people actually understand. Before it was an empire, Rome was a republic. It had a senate, popular assemblies, elected magistrates, checks, and balances. Does that sound familiar again? It's kind of where we live now. The Romans didn't trust kings either. In fact, they hated them so much that rex, the Latin word for king, became an insult. Their solution was to divide power so that no man could rule absolutely. Consuls shared executive authority. The Senate represented the elite, which is not ideal, but it worked for a while. The assemblies represented the people, and the rule of law, lex, applied to everyone, at least in theory. That system lasted centuries, and it created a society obsessed with duty, what they called virtus and gravitas. You were expected to serve something bigger than yourself, the republic, SPQR, Senate people, republic, etc. And it worked, again, for a while. Rome conquered half the known world, built roads, aqueducts, and laws that still echo through every courtroom on earth. But here's the kicker. The republic didn't fall because it was invaded. It fell because it rotted from the inside. Some of the signs of decay, or symptoms rather: power concentrated in just a few hands. The Senate grew corrupt, as one does, and the gap between rich and poor exploded, and populists started weaponizing the masses against the institutions that kept the system stable. Again, sounding familiar? Generals like Julius Caesar realized that they could promise, quote, security and stability to a tired and divided people, and once the legions were loyal to him instead of the republic, it was game over. Caesar crossed the Rubicon, marched on Rome, and eventually had himself declared dictator for life. The Senate cheered, the people celebrated, and the republic died, not to weeps and gnashing of teeth, but to thunderous applause. Now, the founders, they knew that story by heart. They studied it like a crime scene photo. They saw what happens when citizens trade liberty for comfort, when institutions become tools of ambition instead of justice, and when the public forgets what the republic is for. And they swore to design something that wouldn't collapse in the same way. Now, Roman virtue in the American mind is a big part of this, and how it came from them and permeates our culture. John Adams read Cicero like it was scripture. Cicero said freedom is participation in power, recognizing that power exists and it is your duty to participate in it. He believed that liberty required moral restraint, not imposed by a ruler, but chosen by the citizens. That's where the founders got their obsession with virtue, not prudish morality, but self-control, stoicism. the ability to govern yourself before you try to govern someone else. And that's why early Americans taught classical history in schools. They wanted kids to know that liberty isn't some fairy tale, it's fragile as hell. And it dies fast when people get lazy. Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, they all quoted Rome constantly. Even the architecture of D.C., the columns and domes and marble facades, they're not decoration. It's a tribute to where we learned how to do this. A reminder of what happens when a republic stops remembering what it's supposed to be. Polybius, another Roman thinker the founders loved, said that governments moved in cycles. Monarchy becomes tyranny, tyranny breeds revolt, revolt becomes democracy, democracy becomes anarchy, anarchy leads people to beg for order, and they crown a new tyrant. That's the cycle. And the founders looked at this vicious cycle and said, okay, well, how do we break that? How do we make a self-correcting system? Their answer would become the U.S. Constitution, a system of divided powers, checks and balances, and written limits, a structure designed to short-circuit the corruption that had destroyed every free government before them. They wanted ambition to counteract ambition, vice to cancel vice. They knew you couldn't change human nature, so you had to build around it. And that's why we have 3 branches, 2 chambers, and a very complicated process for getting anything done. It's not dysfunction, it's design. The chaos, to some degree, is the point. The Romans also left behind one more lesson, the cultural one. As the Republic died, Romans stopped caring about duty. They wanted bread and circuses, free grain and cheap entertainment. The state gave them both, and in return, the people gave up their voice. Does that sound familiar again? That's the danger of prosperity. You start thinking freedom is the default setting, not a daily fight. You start laughing off corruption, tuning out of politics, and telling yourself it's someone else's problem. And that's exactly how every republic ends. When the founders built America, they didn't see themselves as inventing something new. They saw themselves as trying again, another shot at the ancient ideal of a free republic that wouldn't self-destruct. They knew that what Polybius, Aristotle, and Cicero all knew, that the line between liberty and collapse is razor thin, and it starts with the character of people, the quality of the individual. That's why Madison said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And since we're not, the best we can do is chain power down with law and fight so that we don't get too comfortable holding the keys. So why do we look back on Greece and Rome? What do we take from them? You know, why are we, again, this is not about nostalgia. The idea of the citizen, the rule of law, and the warning of decay, that's what we get from antiquity. The founders carried those lessons like sacred scripture because they knew the republic they were about to build would only last as long as its people could remember them. The Greeks gave us the mind of liberty. Rome gave us its body, but the soul, the belief that every person answers to a higher moral law, not just a state, not just a ruler, that would come later. It would come from a medieval world ruled by kings and priests. A new idea would start to grow from this, that every soul has the right to stand before God and authority as an equal. Kings, prince, pauper, everybody. And that's where we're headed next. Medieval chains, the church feudalism, and Magna Carta. After Rome fell, the lights of the Republic went out for some time. For almost 1,000 years, Europe lived under a different kind of rule, one that wrapped divine authority and brutish power into the same chain. The Middle Ages were a long sleep, not because nothing was happening, but because power had frozen solid. There was no movement. Kings ruled by, quote, divine right. I'm sure you've seen this phrase before, and the church claimed to speak for God himself. Between the throne and the altar, there wasn't much room left for the common man. As a matter of fact, they controlled language such that you had to go to the priest to access God. Plenary indulgences, all of these other things. Freedom didn't disappear, it just went underground, hiding in monasteries and villages, and the hearts of a few mad monks who still believe that no king sits higher than truth. To understand the medieval world, imagine a pyramid with God at the top, and then kings, nobles, knights, peasants, all the way down to the dirt. They called it the, quote, great chain of being. if you want to look into that more. Everything and everyone had a place, and stepping out of it wasn't just rebellion, it was heresy. Now that you've tied the church into this and religion into this, it isn't just rebellion against your king, it's heresy, for which the punishment is death. You didn't own your land, you didn't choose your trade, you didn't question authority. Your duty was obedience to your lord or your priest or your god, in that order. And feudalism was a machine built on dependency. Kings granted land to nobles, nobles granted protection to knights, knights granted, quote, justice to peasants, and peasants worked the land to keep everyone else alive. In a lot of ways, belonged to the land in a hereditary fashion. It was stable, but, suffocating. There's no room for upward mobility there. And for centuries, people were told that hierarchy wasn't just politics, it was by sacred design. Questioning it wasn't just dangerous, it was sinful. And that's what makes the next moment in history so important. But it was the first time that someone told a king no. And that's the Magna Carta, the first crack in the chain. It's 1215 in England. King John, a man, his older brother, Richard the Lionheart, wildly popular, died during the Crusades. King John, wildly unpopular. It's actually where the story of Robin Hood comes from, if you want to look into that at some point, the legend. But he was so wildly unpopular that even his barons, who weren't exactly moral paragons, had enough of his bullshit. He had taxed them dry, seized property, imprisoned all of his rivals, basically treated the realm like his personal ATM. So the barons revolted. They didn't overthrow him, they cornered him. On the fields of Runnymede, under threat of civil war, and the threat of another French invasion, King John was forced to sign a document that changed the world forever. The Magna Carta. Now let's be clear, the Magna Carta wasn't some human rights manifesto, it was a power deal between elites. But within its legal jargon was a revolutionary seed that would grow for hundreds of years to come. The king is not above the law. That sounds obvious to us now, but wasn't obvious at the time, the divine right of kings. He was basically a universal authoritarian. Clause 39 of Magna Carta said no free man could be imprisoned or punished except by, quote, the lawful judgment of his peers and by the law of the land. That's what we now know as due process. It's the ancestor of the Fifth and Sixth Amendments to the United States Constitution. Right there in medieval ink. Hundreds of years, 500 years prior. Clause 12 said the king couldn't tax without consent. That's no taxation without representation. Again, 500 years before it became real. And buried in its preamble was something that sounded suspiciously like limited government. Now, Magna Carta didn't make people free overnight. It cracked the divine armor of monarchy and let just a little bit of light through. It said there's a higher law and even the crown bows to it. Now, the church is a much more complicated story. On the one hand, it was part of the problem. It claimed the power to crown kings, forgive sins, decided who burned at the stake, who had access to God. Again, they kept the Bible in Latin for a very long time so the peasants couldn't read it on their own. It ran courts, collected tithes, and told people their suffering was holy. If the throne didn't get you, the pulpit would. That was the phrase. But on the other hand, and this is the irony, to be honest, and why the Protestant movement is so directly in line with the liberty movement for humanity, the church also preserved the idea that law comes from something higher than man. Even tyrants, they said, answered to divine justice. And for them, some of them actually believed it, obviously. Some of them used it as a way to gain power over kings. But that's a dangerous seed to plant, because once people start thinking the king can sin, they eventually start wondering, why the hell does he get to judge them? Right? Monks copying Aristotle, theologians debating morality. They kept alive the idea that truth isn't dictated by power. That idea will come roaring back later during the Reformation, which we'll get to. But in the meantime, the church played both sides. They played oppressor and protector, jailer and teacher, the same hand blessing and striking. And then we have the common law revolution. While popes and kings were busy fighting each other, something quieter was happening, the birth of common law. English judges started writing down their rulings and creating precedent, laws that applied to everyone, even the king's men. And over time, It formed a legal tradition based on reason, not decree. We still have a lot of this common law in our courts today. It wasn't democratic. Nobody was voting on it. But it was stable, and it gave ordinary people a weapon, the right to appeal, to argue, to cite precedent, and the founders loved that. When Jefferson and Adams studied law, they read Bracton and Coke, medieval jurists who said things like the king must not be under man, but under God and under law. That line's basically the Magna Carta's greatest hit. The founders were the biggest fans of that as well, as somebody who hated kings. And after Magna Carta, kings tried to wiggle out of its terms as kings do. You know, they set limits for themselves and then try to breach them. But the idea had taken root by the 13th century. The barons had evolved into a parliament, a voting bloc, an assembly meant to advise the king and eventually to restrain him. At first, it was talking shop for nobles and clergy, right? Just court, the good old boys, network, maybe you could say, for these days. And then knights and merchants joined in. And over the centuries, it grew teeth. By the 1600s, it was challenging royal authority outright. Of those struggles came an entirely new vocabulary of liberty: petitions, charters, representation, consent of the governed. By the time you get to the English Civil War, Glorious Revolution, those ideas explode. But it all starts here. A bunch of pissed off barons drag their king into a tent and forcing him to sign a piece of parchment that says, in essence, you're not God. So let's pause and ask, why does this medieval detour matter to the Constitution? It's because it taught the founders two things that the ancients could not. First, that power loves to hide behind sanctity, whether it's a throne or a cross or modern bureaucracy. And second, that sometimes freedom doesn't start with a revolution, it starts with restraint. The medieval world didn't produce democracy, but it did give us limits, checks on authority that became the scaffolding for liberty and on. Every time the church fought the crown, or parliament forced a king's hand, or a court cited an older precedent to block abuse, they were hammering out the rule of law one case at a time. And that's how it's built. By the 18th century, the slow grind had built an entire political culture where power wasn't absolute. That's the culture the colonists inherited. It's why they instinctively distrusted any government that said, just trust us. Trust me, bro. Trust the science. They'd been watching that lie for 800 years. The Middle Ages may look like darkness from a distance, but the truth is, this is where freedom learned how to survive in the dark. The Magna Carta wasn't written by idealists, it was written by survivors, men sick of being shaken down by the same divine racket that's haunted every century since. They didn't topple the system, they cracked it. And once a crack appears, light gets in. We all know that sunlight is the best disinfectant. The founders studied that moment, not because it was noble, but because it was effective. And it proved that even in the worst of times, law could put a leash on power. And that is the heartbeat of the Constitution, not chaos, not rebellion for its own sake, but a cold, calculated insistence that no one, no matter how holy or how powerful, gets to sit above the law. The ancient world gave us a blueprint for liberty. The medieval world gave us the locks and the hinges. But it'll take something even bigger to wake Europe up again, a movement that starts not with kings or soldiers, but with conscience. Again, back to this idea of individual liberty being tied to moral character, a spiritual rebellion that sets fire to the idea that obedience in itself is holy. And we're talking about the Reformation and the rise of what we now call individual conscience. So it's Halloween, technically, October 31st, 1517. And a monk named Martin Luther walks up to the Kasseldorf Church in Wittenberg, Germany, and nails 95 arguments to it, the 95 Theses. You may have heard of it. He's not starting a revolution, not yet. He's just pissed off. But that single act, hammer, parchment, and conviction sends shockwaves through history. Because for the first time in 1,000 years, someone with real theological authority tells the most powerful institution on earth, you're full of shit. Now, the Reformation wasn't about politics, not at first at least. It was about the human soul. The church had turned salvation into a business model. You could literally buy your way out of sin. Plenary indulgences, they called them. There's nothing biblical about that. And Luther called bullshit. He said salvation isn't a transaction between man and an institution. It's a matter between the soul and God. No priest, no bishop, no pope in Rome stands between a person and divine truth. Now, that sounds like mere theology, but it's dynamite. Because once you teach people that they can read scripture for themselves, that they can interpret truth without permission, you've now told them they can think for themselves as well. And that's how revolutions start, not with gunpowder, but with literacy. And Luther didn't mean to start a war, but once the printing press got a hold of his words, it was all over after that. For the first time in human history, ideas traveled faster than armies. Pamphlets, sermons, treatises, millions of pages flying through Europe, lighting fires in people's minds. The old order, the fusion of church and state, couldn't stop it. Because you can burn books, but you can't burn the question, what if they're wrong? And we discovered that freedom of conscience means freedom of thought. The Reformation cracked more than just the church, cracked the very idea of collective authority. If every person has a direct line to truth, then no human power can claim absolute authority over another, ever. That's the seed of individual rights. Before there was freedom of speech or press, there was freedom of conscience. The right to stand alone before the world and say, I will not recant. The phrase, I will not recant, became the spiritual DNA of the Western mind. You see it today in America, a certain fuck you attitude that people have towards the government that just doesn't exist other places. The kids at Columbine refusing to renounce God even in the face of certain death. That shit's in our blood. It's what makes us who we are. When Luther said it at his trial in 1521, standing before the emperor, he wasn't just defending his faith. He was defending the idea that conviction outweighs command. The same idea will echo later through every man who signs his name at the bottom of the Declaration of Independence. They'll be doing what Luther did, standing up to an empire, the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and saying, my conscience is not for sale. Now, the Reformation didn't make Europe more peaceful. Quite the opposite, as ripping a Band-Aid does sometimes. It tore the continent apart. Wars of religion ravaged Germany, France, England. Protestants and Catholics slaughtered each other by the millions. It was bloody and ugly and often hypocritical, and a lot of people use these times for their own gain, as you know. But out of chaos came something civilization had never seen before, the slow separation of church and state. Because when two groups both claim to have God's truth, the only sane solution is to keep God out of the government business altogether. And that's where early thinkers started to ask, what if government exists not to save souls but to protect rights? Natural rights. The question will travel straight into the Enlightenment and from there into our Constitution. But first, the Reformation had to break the monopoly on truth. And here we can pause for a moment and just consider the printing press and what it meant. These new modalities of communication always change the world forever. The printing press, radio, television, the internet, obviously. The printing press, though, at the time that it came about, changed everything. Before Gutenberg, books were only hand-copied by monks. Knowledge was a luxury good. It was slow, expensive, and very easy to control because only a few people could transcribe. After Gutenberg, a single press could print hundreds of books in just a few days. Information exploded. The Bible was translated into local languages. Ordinary people could read it for themselves, and that's when literacy became power. When knowledge stopped being a privilege, it became a weapon. And that's why tyrants have always feared books. Because once people can read, they can argue. Once they can argue, they stop obeying blindly. Sound familiar? The internet's basically Gutenberg with better bandwidth, same pattern, same panic. And when you democratize knowledge, you stabilize every hierarchy built on ignorance. Destabilize, excuse me. The founders centuries later knew exactly what they meant. An informed citizen is the tyrant's worst nightmare. Now, Luther wasn't the only reformer. In Geneva, John Calvin built a city based on discipline and self-governing congregations. The people there elected their ministers, ran their communities, decided moral disputes collectively. Very strict, but it planted a powerful idea, self-rule, under a shared faith. When English Puritans carried Calvin's ideas across the Atlantic, they brought the same model of governance, town meetings, church votes, collective discipline. It was expected that everybody would participate. It wasn't democracy as we know it today, but it was close enough to light that fuse. In those New England towns, people practiced running their own affairs. They debated, argued, compromised, set up memorandums of understanding and agreements. And once you've had a taste of that, you don't really go back to kneeling for kings anymore. You don't add the middleman back into that conversation. So yeah, the founders weren't just pulling this stuff out of thin air. All of this stuff was built. It was built very intentionally. The Reformation gave them the cultural habit of self-government long before there was a constitution to protect it. The most radical thing about the Reformation wasn't the theology, it was the psychology. It told ordinary people that they were morally competent. They didn't need somebody else to justify their morality. They didn't need to outsource their conscience to an institution. Think about it. Once you teach people to question authority in religion, it's only a matter of time before they start questioning authority in government. And that is why it was heresy for so long. Once they learn to interpret scripture, they start interpreting law. Once they refuse to confess to a priest, they'll refuse to confess to a tyrant as well. And that's the line from Luther's hammer to Jefferson's pen, from, quote, "Here I stand," to "We hold these truths to be self-evident." And that's the line that runs through every American institution that protects individual rights. Free press, free speech, free exercise of religion, because founders understood something that Europe had bled to learn. You can't have a free society without a free conscience. Now, let's not romanticize it. The Reformation also unleashed fanaticism. People convinced that their truth gave them license to kill. The dark twin of conscience, they call it, when conviction hardens into self-righteousness. But even that had a lesson. It taught thinkers like Locke and Montesquieu that liberty has to rest on tolerance, on rules that protect disagreement in a peaceful way. Otherwise, freedom is just a new kind of tyranny. That's why founders didn't build a, quote, Christian nation necessarily. They built a free one where religion could thrive without being ruled by somebody. A Christian nation, a theocracy, is overseen by somebody who dictates what that means. You, the American people, chose to make this a Christian nation. Not as a theocracy, but by choice. The Reformation didn't just split the church, it split the human soul between obedience, conscience, and faith and freedom. And then we get to choose, which is the entire point of faith in the first place. And in that fracture, the modern world was born, because once people start thinking for themselves, everything changes. Science, philosophy, politics, art, even government. And that's the lineage of liberty. It starts with the courage to say, no, I have to answer to something higher than you, a man. I answer to my God, or I answer to my constitution, or my country, or whatever. And the founders inherited courage. They didn't all share the same theology, but they shared the same defiance, the same stubbornness that says truth is not up for a vote. And the Enlightenment would take the torch from faith and pass it to philosophy. And that's where the founders found their playbook. By the time the Enlightenment rolls around, Europe's a mess. The Reformation cracked the old order, but it left a mess in its wake. The wars of religion torched half the continent. People were tired of killing each other over theology. There was a fatigue. So a new generation of thinkers, philosophers, scientists, economists decide to build the world from scratch, rebuild it. They ask a new kind of question. What if we use reason instead of revolution to understand ourselves? And this is the Enlightenment period. And it was a great heist. Their greatest heist was stealing the idea of power back from kings and priests and handing it back to the individual. We call this the Age of Reason. Plenty of contradictions and egos, but beneath it all was one core conviction. The truth could be discovered by observation, debate, and logic, not decreed by authority. Science exploded. Newton figured out the laws of motion. Galileo mapped the heavens. Descartes built a whole philosophy from I think, therefore I am, this idea that we are more than our physical body. But the political thinkers like Hobbes, like Montesquieu, Rousseau, Hume, Smith, they're the ones who gave the founders the intellectual blueprint. And they didn't agree on everything. I mean, they barely agreed on anything. Neither did John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, by the way, two best friends who helped found this country. But they all wrestled with the same question. How do you build a society that lets people live free without tearing itself apart? From Thomas Hobbes in 17th century England, there's a civil war raging, heads are rolling, and Hobbes is hiding out in France writing a book called Leviathan. He looks around at all the chaos and basically says, well, people fucking suck. And in Hobbes' view, the natural state of humanity is violent and paranoid and selfish. A war of all against all, I believe is how the phrase went. And without authority, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So he says we make a social contract, we give up some freedom to a strong central authority that keeps us from killing each other. It's order through fear. The first modern argument for the state, actually. And the founders read Hobbes. They respected him, and then they said, no thanks, guy. We'll take freedom with a side of risk. Thank you very much. But they had also seen what happens when you let fear justify tyranny, right? So they were insulated from that bad idea. And then comes John Locke, the godfather of American political philosophy. Look, Locke looks at Hobbes' grim view of human nature and says, hold on, we're not beasts, we're moral agents. You have the choice to be good or be evil. Locke's key insight was people are born with natural rights, life, liberty, and property. And those rights don't come from the government, they're inherent. Governments exist to protect them, not to grant them. And if government fails, if it becomes destructive to those ends, then people have a right to abolish it. Does that sound familiar? Because it's in our Declaration of Independence. Jefferson literally lifted that. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's Locke's philosophy translated into American poetry. Now, Locke's social contract wasn't about obedience, it's about trust. Government's a servant, not a master. And if you break that trust, the fucking deal's off. That's the beating heart of the American Revolution and the Constitution itself. Now there's Montesquieu, a French nobleman turned into a political architecturist. I don't even know what you would call him. In The Spirit of Laws, 1748, if you want to read that book, it's great. He argued that power must be divided to stay honest. He studied Rome and England and the ruins of every empire, and he recognized that if one person holds too much power, then we've got problems, right? So his conclusion is this phrase, power should check power. He called it separation of powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, each one balancing out the other. And James Madison loved that idea so much he practically built the Constitution around it. Federalist Paper 51, actually, in a nutshell, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. That's where that phrase comes from. Montesquieu wasn't just writing theory, he was writing mechanics. He understood the moral insights of Locke, and he put them into an operating system. And then you've got Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a bit of a wild card. He said that man was born free, but everywhere in chains. He hated corruption, inequality, and the dead weight of aristocracy. His big idea was the general will, the legitimate authority, comes from collective agreement of the people. That's democratic, right? But there's a danger there because the people can become as tyrannical as any king. When the general will gets twisted into mob rule, freedom tends to die pretty quickly. The founders studied Rousseau carefully, admired his passion. They feared his excess. He was a bit of a fanatic when it comes to democracy. So they took his idea of consent, but they built guardrails against it. Representation, law, Bill of Rights. And then there's this missing link that comes next, and it's the Scottish Enlightenment. You don't hear much about this one. Across the channel, they were adding something essential, which is character. Thinkers like David Hume and Adam Smith and Francis Hutcheson, they focused on virtue, sympathy, and moral sense, and believed that freedom only works when people discipline themselves, when civic virtue balances personal liberty. Adam Smith is best known for The Wealth of Nations. He wasn't just talking about money. He argued that markets work best when people act with moral restraint, not just from greed alone. And that's the kind of, quote, invisible hand idea that the founders understood. Not divine luck, but human decency guiding self-interest. They made liberty practical and said you can't legislate morality, but you can cultivate it through education, commerce, and civil society. And Jefferson loved that. He ate it up. That's why the American system doesn't just rely on laws. It relies on the moral fiber of the citizen themselves. As George Washington warned in his farewell address, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. Now, here's where it gets tricky. The Enlightenment gave humanity tools like reason, science, and individual rights, but tools don't choose how they're used. The same logic that gave us liberty also gave us efficient tyranny. Bureaucracies, propaganda, industrial warfare. That's why the founders were careful. They wanted power of reason without losing the humility of conscience. They didn't see faith and reason as enemies, and nor should you. They saw them as guardrails, keeping each other from running off the cliff. As Paul would say in the New Testament, study all things and hold fast to that which is true. Reason without virtue becomes cynicism. Virtue without reason becomes fanaticism. The Constitution was designed to walk that razor's edge. By the late 1700s, all these ideas, natural rights, separation of powers, freedom of conscience, had spread like wildfire across the Atlantic. Colonies had been reading, printing, debating for decades. Every tavern in Boston, was a philosophy seminar with a beer, which is the way to do it, I think. Maybe try hard AF. But when the founders finally said enough, they weren't acting out of pure anger. They were acting on intellectual tradition that stretched from Athens to Geneva. They knew what they were doing. They'd studied the autopsies of dead republics and decided they could build one that actually lived. Their revolution wasn't just a rebellion against a king. It was a culmination of 2,000 years of trial and error. Philosophy turning into policy. And that's what made it different. The American Revolution wasn't chaos. It was order by design, reason and rights bound together in a written constitution. The Enlightenment gave founders the language of liberty, the grammar of self-government. It replaced divine command with rational principle. It replaced obedience with understanding. And it handed them one last crucial lesson. If you want freedom to last, you can't just love it. You have to think it. You have to believe it. You have to defend it with argument, not emotion. Because tyranny doesn't always show up with chains. Sometimes it shows up dressed as certainty. And that's why founders wrote instead of preached. They didn't want worshipers. They wanted citizens, active participants. The Enlightenment taught humanity how to think for itself. But thought alone doesn't build nations. You need practice, trial runs, early experiments, and running your own affairs. And that's exactly what happened across the Atlantic. Before there was revolution, there were colonies. And in those colonies, Americans were already learning how to govern themselves. Colonial America was pretty interesting. A lot of experiments in self-government. It wasn't very uniform. By the early 1600s, the Enlightenment's ideas were crossing the ocean in the holds of ships. But the men and women aboard weren't philosophers. They were survivors. Farmers, merchants, Puritans, soldiers, looking for a fresh start. They were looking for breathing room from kings who wouldn't stop talking about taxes, or priests who wouldn't stop talking about salvation. They didn't plan to invent a new political system. They just wanted to live without somebody whose boot on their neck. But that craving, freedom mixed with grit, became the seed of the American character. Before Plymouth Rock was even cold, the Pilgrims had a problem. They had landed way north of where their charter said they could. No legal authority, no governor, no clear rules. So what did they do? They wrote one, the Mayflower Compact, 1620. 41 men in a cramped ship's cabin agreeing to, quote, combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. Translation, we'll govern ourselves. It was short, plain, and revolutionary. No king, no bishop, just the people making a deal with each other. And that was the first written constitution in the New World. Every colony after that copied the idea, written agreements, elected councils, accountability. The founders would look back at that moment and see the prototype of everything they later built, a government that exists only by consent. Down in Virginia, things took a slightly different shape. It was less a city on a hill and more of venture capital with muskets. But even profit seekers hate being bossed around. So in 1619, the Virginia Company authorized the first representative assembly in the Americas, the House of Burgesses. Men elected by local freemen met to make laws and taxes. One of the first orders of business was setting limits on the governor. They didn't call it democracy. They just called it common sense. If you pay for the goddamn colony, you should have a say in how it runs. Taxation without representation. That instinct, representation tied to property and responsibility, became the backbone of the later Constitution Republican model. No taxation without representation did not start in Boston. It started right there in Jamestown. So over the next century and a half, 13 colonies sprouted along the Atlantic coast, each with its own flavor, religion, economy, but with one thing in common: distance from the crown. 3,000 miles of ocean is a pretty good buffer. By the time a royal decree reached Massachusetts, people had already done whatever the hell they wanted to do anyways. So they built town meetings, county courts, colonial assemblies. They voted and argued and taxed themselves. They learned the machinery of governance the same way farmers learned to fix a plow, by breaking it a few times. This is what Alex de Tocqueville would later call the art of association. Americans didn't wait for orders. They gathered, debated, and got it done. Self-rule was a theory. It was Tuesday night at the meeting house. Most colonists came here chasing religious freedom, but quickly learned it's easier to demand tolerance than to practice it. The Puritans in Massachusetts exiled dissenters like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson for questioning doctrine. Williams wandered into the wilderness, founded Rhode Island, and wrote the first charter guaranteeing freedom of conscience. He argued that civil authority had no business policing faith. Quote, a hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. And Jefferson would later borrow that exact metaphor. So from the start, America was a messy lab where religious liberty had to coexist with community order. Out of that friction came the First Amendment centuries later, the right to believe, preach, or ignore religion entirely. By the early 1700s, colonial newspapers were everywhere. The New York Weekly Journal, edited by John Peter Zenger, took shots at the royal governor, and Zenger got thrown in jail for seditious libel. His defense was simple: truth isn't libel, and a jury agreed. A 1735 verdict didn't just free Zenger, it established the principle that the press can criticize power without fear of the gallows. The founders would later carve that into the Bill of Rights. I mean, it's a monumental case. Same with juries. Colonists demanded trial by peers instead of royal judges. They saw the courtroom as the last line between the citizen and tyranny. And that's the DNA of the Fifth and Sixth Amendments, born in colonial courthouses that smelled like wood smoke and ink. Another thing the colonists did right, they educated their children. The Puritans passed laws requiring towns to fund schools so children could read scripture and spot lies. That was their civic armor, they called it. By the 1700s, colonial literacy rates were among the highest in the world. That meant that pamphlets, broadsides, revolutionary arguments, etc., spread like wildfire when the time came. It was battlefield preparation for the revolution to come. You can't manipulate a population that actually reads the fine print. That's the lesson. Freedom demands homework, and America started doing it pretty damn early. Each colony became a test run for different constitutional principles. And you can see this if you read the history of the colonies, but also their colonial constitutions of themselves, state constitutions. Rhode Island was really focused on religious liberty. Virginia really focused on representative government. Pennsylvania, fair trade and Quaker tolerance. Massachusetts was big on public education and civic duty. They didn't always get along. They fought wars with the natives, bickered over boundaries, blah, blah, blah. But even in their failures, they were learning how to govern. It's messy. They learned how to argue in public without tearing the whole thing down. And then came the weirdest gift Britain ever gave America: neglect. As long as the colonies paid taxes and stayed loyal on paper, London didn't micromanage. Colonial governors were usually outnumbered, outvoted, or just drunk assholes. Didn't do anything. That left local assemblies to basically run the show. So we had a lot of experience in governing. We didn't just create a new government out of thin air. We had a lot of experience in governing by the time the revolution happened. So when the Parliament suddenly tried to tighten its control in the 1760s with new taxes, regulations, soldiers in the streets, the colonists didn't react like rebels. They reacted like people who had already been free for generations. They weren't asking for revolution. They were demanding a return to the status quo. That's what made the British so clueless. They thought they were disciplining subjects like they had all over the world, but they were actually provoking citizens. By the eve of the revolution, Americans had developed a unique identity. Independent, argumentative, suspicious of authority, and pretty damn proud of all those things. They built economies from scratch, defended themselves in frontier wars, and learned to compromise in assemblies. They had one foot in Enlightenment philosophy and the other in hard-earned pragmatism. They didn't dream of utopia. They built fences. They wrote laws, and they held town votes until something actually worked. Trial and error. That's why the Constitution later worked. It wasn't theory to them. It was muscle memory. They had been doing it for 150 years. As John Adams put it, the revolution was in the minds and hearts of people before they ever fired a shot. The mental revolution, the belief that ordinary citizens could run their own damn country, was decades old at this point. Colonial America was the apprenticeship of liberty, actually, because they had been ignored by Britain. While Europe argued in salons, Americans were experimenting in real time with ballots, contracts, sermons. Yeah, every petition to a royal governor, every local vote, every pamphlet that pissed someone off, it was practice for 1776. So when the moment came to tell the most powerful empire on earth to go fuck themselves, we didn't really have to hesitate. I mean, it was just natural. They had been preparing for it for years as soon as they stepped out the boat to some degree. Now, the colonies didn't stumble into revolution. They grew into it. It was the natural next step for us. They learned that self-government works. We knew it. They couldn't tell us that it didn't work because we had done it and we knew it worked. We knew that free people, given the chance, can build order without a crown breathing down our necks. And that's the end of it. At that point, there was no turning back. Now, by the mid-1700s, the colonies weren't just growing, they were boiling. A century and a half of self-rule had created people who thought like citizens and fought like survivors. And then the empire that birthed them forgot who the hell it was dealing with. The British Crown saw the colonies as an investment, lumber, tobacco, sugar, taxes, whatever they could drain out of us. And the colonists saw themselves as free Englishmen, entitled to the same rights as anyone in London. That difference in perspective was about to light a fuse. After the French and Indian War, Britain was broke and figured the colonies should help pay for the bill. So Parliament started slapping taxes on everything: paper, tea, glass, even legal documents. And every time the colonists pushed back, London doubled down. They called it governance. And the colonists called it tyranny, wearing a powdered wig. The Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 67, the Tea Act of 73, each one a slap in the fucking face. And the colonists learned fast that outrage needs organization. They formed committees of correspondence, organized boycotts, printed pamphlets that lit up every town from Boston to Charleston. The British saw an unruly mob. That's what they expected, because that's what they had seen everywhere else. But what they were really watching was civilization remembering its power. By 1775, talking just wasn't working anymore. When the British troops marched on Lexington and Concord to seize colonial weapons, local militias met them with muskets and a bit of a fuck you attitude, as we mentioned before. No one really knows who fired the first shot, but history knows what it started: the war for the first government built on consent. That morning, farmers and blacksmiths faced off against the strongest army on earth and didn't back down. They weren't fighting for a throne. They were fighting for the right to just say no. A year later, the Declaration of Independence turned that defiance into doctrine. Drafted by Jefferson, edited by Franklin and Adams, and approved by Congress. It's part philosophy and part middle finger. It starts with an audacious claim: we hold these truths to be self-evident, not granted by kings, not gifted by government, self-evident. Rights that exist before law: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then it lays out logic. Government's job is to protect those rights, and if it doesn't, the people can throw it out like bad furniture. That's Locke with attitude. That's 2,000 years of political philosophy boiled down into one sentence that still terrifies tyrants to this day. Jefferson's words weren't polite. They weren't meant to be. They were a declaration of moral adulthood. We don't need your goddamn permission anymore. After independence, the colonies had a new problem, which is how to stay united without building another monster of centralized power. The first attempt was the Articles of Confederation, basically a friendship bracelet between states, no executive branch, no power to tax, no real authority. It was freedom termed up to 11, and it didn't work. A lot of people say if Jefferson had gotten his way, or I'm sorry, if Adams had gotten his way, we would have had another monarchy, and if Jefferson had gotten his way, we wouldn't have had a country at all. Some balance between there. States bickered, debts piled up, soldiers went unpaid. When farmers in Massachusetts rose up in Shays' Rebellion, the new nation realized something brutal. Liberty without structure collapses pretty fast. The same people who had fought to break chains now had to decide how to forge them anew, this time with locks on power, not on people. So, Philadelphia, 1787. Maybe you've heard of this before. 55 delegates gather in the heat of a Pennsylvania summer, windows shut tight for secrecy, sweating their asses off, yelling at each other. This is the forge where the blueprint for the modern republic takes shape. Washington presides, Franklin mediates, Madison and Hamilton argue like crazy people. They hated each other. They fight over everything: representation, taxation, slavery, the presidency, the courts. But beneath the shouting, one principle holds steady. Government must have power, but power must have limits. And they build those limits into every seam of government. Checks and balances, the bicameral legislature, separation of powers, federalism, dividing national and state authority. And then they do something unheard of in history. They write it down, not as a royal decree, but as a contract between what government may exist and every citizen that comes from that point forward. It's not a command, it's a covenant. It's the people saying, we'll give you power, but only this much, and we're keeping the fucking receipt. Of course, not everyone was sold. The ink wasn't even dry before the biggest political fight in history broke out. The Federalists, Madison, Hamilton, Jay, said the new Constitution was strong enough to hold the Union together without threatening liberty. They wrote the Federalist Papers to explain every line of it, laying out the logic for a republic that could survive its own ambition. The anti-Federalists weren't buying it. They smelled tyranny in every clause. Men like Patrick Henry and George Mason demanded explicit guarantees of rights. Freedom of speech, religion, press, arms, fair trial. They didn't trust government, and honestly, they had no reason to. They had been disarmed before. At least the British government had tried. They sure as hell weren't going to sign a governing document that didn't guarantee the right to defend themselves against a tyrannical government. So that tension, trust versus skepticism, became the permanent heartbeat of American politics. Trust but verify. And in the end, compromise won. The states ratified the Constitution, but only after promising a Bill of Rights. That addition would turn a powerful framework into a moral one. So we added 10 amendments, the people's non-negotiables. These are the non-negotiables. Everything else we can negotiate. But first, obviously, freedom of speech, press, and religion. Second, the right to bear arms. Protection against unreasonable searches, self-incrimination, and cruel punishment. The guarantee of due process and trial by jury. And the 10th Amendment, the big one, reminding the federal government that anything not granted to it belongs to the states or the people. Now, we don't really follow that one anymore, unfortunately, but that is how the framers decided this country should run. Now, the Bill of Rights wasn't just a decoration. It was the fuse box, the circuit breaker that kept government from overloading. It said in plain language, there are boundaries, and if you cross them, we will replace you. That's not rebellion. It's responsible architecture. It's in the law. That's not terrorism. It's not rebellion. It's not revolution. It's the manual for how to run this country. When Washington took the oath of office in 1789, the experiment began in earnest. The same men who'd risked their necks to win freedom now had to learn to wield power without actually betraying what they were fighting for. And here's what's wild. They knew it might not last. They knew republics fall to apathy, corruption, and greed, but they built it anyway, betting that virtue, education, and public spirit could keep the machine running. They weren't naive. They were disciplined. They'd seen too much blood to romanticize power. The revolution wasn't about chaos. It was about control. Not control of the people, but by the people. The Constitution was hammered together from fire and philosophy. a product of reason sharpened by war. Every article is a scar, a lesson that we've learned. Every amendment is a correction from that lesson. It's not perfect, it's human, but it's alive, and it was built for an imperfect people. The founders didn't expect blind loyalty. They expected participation. They built a machine that only runs if we keep our hands on the wheel. That's the true legacy of the revolution. Not independence, but responsibility. It's what we talk about on this show all the time, about what it means to be a citizen. Freedom without duty is just noise. The Constitution gave America its framework, but even a masterpiece needs maintenance. The coming decades would test it again and again with amendments, crises, wars, reinvention, and all this other stuff. Non-stop. Over the next 2 centuries, America would test every clause, every principle, every moral nerve of that document. And every test came with a price. Amendments written in blood, protests written in sweat, progress paid for with pain. And that's the story of expanding the republic, the long, messy fight to make the Constitution keep its word. And there's only one way to do it. It's by you being involved. It's by being educated, being well-lettered, taking the time yourself to not just do, but to know. The founders didn't treat the Constitution as sacred scripture. They treated it as a machine. It is an engine through which you can put any problem, and on the other side of it, get a reasonable, moral answer. And these are practical things, right? We don't want a revolution every 15 or 25 years. Even then, we had one, a civil war. By 1860, the country had split in half over the same question that the founders had dodged, unfortunately, which is slavery. Now, I say unfortunately, they knew they couldn't get the country to all come together if they banned it like they wanted to in the beginning. The South called it states' rights, and the North called it a moral abomination. Both were right about one thing. The Constitution wasn't clear enough. And this is why the Constitution has this capability to make amendments. That's why it has a Supreme Court to adjudicate. Now, when the smoke cleared, 600,000 Americans were dead, but the Union survived. And the wreckage came 3 of the most important lines ever added to the document. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, understanding that every man has natural rights, that the ultimate among those is property rights, and the ultimate property is himself. The 14th Amendment defined citizenship and guaranteed equal protection under the law. And the 15th banned racial discrimination in voting, at least on paper, although it would continue for some time. The Constitution went from protecting liberty for some to promising it for all. And while it took a while for that to catch up in enforcement, a century actually, which came and went in waves, it eventually came. And that was the beauty of the Constitution. It is a self-correcting apparatus. And that's the way it was designed to be. Now, the 20th century hits fast. World wars, depression, technological revolution. Each crisis tested whether the Constitution could stretch without snapping. I think we made some mistakes. Obviously, prohibition was stupid. The 18th Amendment was dumb. The 16th Amendment to create federal income tax, don't like that. Don't like that. The direct election of senators, cutting out the state legislatures and giving more power to voters, at least that's what they said. What actually happened was that we just created 2 obstructionist bodies. But this is the thing. It's not perfect. It's made for an imperfect people. And there are constitutional processes still there, things that we can build from today, but only if you understand where we came from. 238 years after it was signed, the Constitution is still here, still argued over, still misquoted on cable news, but it's still the North Star, the longest running experiment in self-government this world has ever seen. That's a hell of a record, especially for a country that can't agree on what to eat for lunch, on what fucking reality is. But here's the question that really matters. Does it still work? In a world of algorithms and surveillance and global empires and attention spans measured in seconds, does that parchment in Philadelphia still have power? Or are we just coasting on momentum, hoping the engine doesn't seize? And that's the fight of our time. Not whether the Constitution is outdated, but whether we're still worthy of it. Let's start with the elephant in the room. How do you interpret this thing? You've got the originalists. People say the Constitution means precisely what it meant when it was written, and it's a good idea. If you want to change it, amend it. Don't twist it. They see the document as a fixed contract, words with teeth. Change the meaning and you destroy the trust. On the other side, you have the living constitutionalists. Folks who argue that society evolves and interpretation has to evolve with it. They see the document as a framework, not a cage, and they believe the founders built it to adapt, not just to ossify. And the truth is both sides have a point. Originalism keeps us honest. Living interpretation keeps us relevant. The real danger isn't philosophy. It's pretending that the text doesn't matter at all. We can have these debates, but we must be informed and we must actually have the debate and not shout past and over one another. Because the minute you start treating the Constitution like a suggestion instead of structure, you're one crisis away from monarchy with better branding. And let's not sugarcoat it. The threats today don't look like redcoats or monarchs. So we do need to think of these things in modern terms. They wear suits. They run tech companies. They talk about efficiency. They see everything you do on these machines. They promise convenience in exchange for control. 1,000 tiny compromises that don't feel like tyranny until it's too late. The boiling frog. Government surveillance justified by safety. Censorship justified by civility. Economic manipulation justified by stability. Every generation has its wolves. Ours just learned how to smile for the fucking camera. The founders couldn't imagine the internet or drones, but they damn sure knew about human nature. They knew that power never stops reaching, it just changes shape. And that's why our principles still hold. Checks and balances, free press, due process, and a well-armed, well-informed citizenry that doesn't scare. These aren't old-fashioned ideas, they're firewalls for the digital age. The real poison is apathy. Rome didn't fall because its enemies were stronger. It fell because its citizens stopped caring. They traded duty for distraction, principles for comfort. And if we're being honest, we're flirting with the same goddamn disease right now. Civil ignorance is the new illiteracy. People know every lyric to a pop song, but they can't name the 3 branches of government. We treat voting like jury duty, something to dodge if possible. And we talk about freedom like it's a fucking inheritance and not our work to do. Liberty isn't self-cleaning if you don't maintain it, it rusts. That's why the founders built the system around us. They didn't trust kings or elites or bureaucrats. They trusted citizens. And if we stop earning the trust, the system collapses under its own weight. So what does civic virtue look like now? It's not about waving flags or memorizing dates. It's about discipline. Reading before reacting. Arguing without hating. Demanding truth even when it's inconvenient. It's about the little things. Showing up at local meetings, mentoring your kids and other kids. Calling bullshit when power lies on either side, yours included. Washington called virtue the spring of Republican government. He meant that laws can restrain evil, but only character can sustain liberty. You can't legislate virtue, but you can goddamn well practice it. And that's what we're missing. Not intelligence per se. People think we're all dumb. What we're missing is integrity. The Constitution's greatest weakness isn't its design, it's our apathy. The hardware is still solid. It's the operators who keep crashing it. So where do we go from here? Technology is rewriting what it meant to be private, to be free, even to be human. AI and biosurveillance and central bank digital currencies create monopolies that act like governments, all of them testing the limits of our old framework. And yet the answer isn't to toss the Constitution, it's to reapply it. To recognize that its principles, consent and checks and rights and decentralization, most of all, are exactly what this century needs. Every generation inherits 2 things: freedom and the responsibility to defend it. We didn't earn the first one, but we damn sure have to earn the second. Jefferson said the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. He wasn't being poetic, he was warning us. You can't sleepwalk through history. Every time a citizen shrugs and says it doesn't matter, some tyrant somewhere hears go ahead. But here's the hope. The same spirit that carried from Athens to Philadelphia still lives here. It lives in soldiers and whistleblowers and parents and skeptics and soldiers again. Let's mention soldiers a few more times because I feel like you guys have, myself included, a real responsibility after this GWAT stuff to apply these lessons and to show leadership. It lives in you and anyone who gives a damn about truth more than comfort. Liberty isn't just dying, it's waiting for people to remember how to use it. So yeah, the Constitution still works when we do. It's not a museum piece, it's a mirror. It reflects exactly who we are, brave or cowardly, honest or corrupt, awake or asleep. And every clause and amendment and argument we've covered in the past hour and a half or so boils down to one idea. Power belongs to people, but only if they can handle it. We weren't given a utopia, we were given a responsibility. And while that might feel heavy, good. It's supposed to. Freedom is work. It's grit and duty and sacrifice and grace, and it's worth every bit. So keep reading, keep questioning, keep showing up, because we the people doesn't just mean them back then. It means you, us, right now. This has been Citizen Podcast.